Tonight on Nation to Nation, Senator Murray Sinclair weighs in on current affairs affecting Indigenous people across the country.
But I think generally Manitoba is suffering from just a lack of provincial government preparation and planning.
And there's a new healing foundation for 60 Scoop survivors. We speak to a survivor and board member about that foundation's purpose.
One of the things that is one of those priorities is cultural reclamation and its reunification. Getting tools out there, programs and services.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamourant and welcome to Nation. Senator Murray Sinclair is certainly familiar to Indigenous people, whether it's his current job or as the former Chief Commissioner of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In fact, just a week ago, he was the virtual keynote speaker talking TRC at Northern College in Timmins, Ontario. Senator Sinclair, it's been well over a year since you were last on Nation to Nation, so welcome back.
Well, thank you very much, Todd. Thanks for having me.
First off, from your perspective in the Senate, how do you think Indigenous Services has handled the pandemic response on First Nations?
Well, I think it's been kind of scattered and a little inconsistent. For the most part, most of the effort and success of the effort in terms of keeping the numbers down at the beginning was largely because the communities themselves were setting blockades up to keep people from moving in and out of the communities and restricting movement and addressing issues at their level. In terms of services that were being provided, there was not a substantial increase in medical services nor in providing the kinds of resources that other communities were getting. So I think to a large extent, Indigenous communities were rather lucky that they were able to avoid the first wave. But the second wave is where they're getting caught, because I think now we're finding that more and more people are traveling outside of the communities, and when they come back, they bring the virus with them, and communities are not able to participate in provincial programs because provinces take the position that it's a federal responsibility, and as a result, Indigenous Services is having to carry the freight, so to speak, with regard to providing those services, and I think they kind of got caught a little unprepared.
Just like everywhere else, your home province has seen a sharp rise in COVID cases. So what should Manitoba Premier Brian Pallister have done differently?
Generally, Manitoba is suffering from just a lack of provincial government preparation and planning, and also a pretty lackadaisical attitude on the part of the provincial government that they felt they had it under control. They opened up the economy. They sent children back to school, even at the high school ages. And as a result, and the other thing is, of course, that they totally failed to protect the seniors and the elders who are in the personal care homes from the pandemic, and failed to monitor what was going on at that level. And the private corporations that have been running those personal care homes have been failing and neglectful in their responsibilities to those people. And we're seeing significant numbers of deaths in personal care homes, some of them being Indigenous people, of course, because there are very few rather, personal care homes to speak of in Indigenous communities. And so it really concerns me that the province has failed to protect Indigenous people who are off reserve. And we have to remember that in terms of First Nation numbers, about 60% or more of Indigenous people live off reserve. And in terms of the Métis, of course, they're all outside of reserve communities and part of the provincial jurisdiction.
I just want to turn to a different topic right now. A few weeks ago, you were sharply critical of the federal government's handling of the lobster dispute in Nova Scotia, but you put some of the blame on the Supreme Court of Canada. Why?
Well, it was the decision which recognized the treaty right to fish to begin with. I think that has come to be at the fore of the problem. There were two Marshall decisions, and people tend to forget that. The first Marshall decision, the Supreme Court very clearly said that the Treaty of 1752 recognized and protected the right of Mi'kmaq, Passamaquoddy, and Maliseet people to fish as they always had before. And that's the way the treaty reads, and that there was no attempt on the part of colonial authorities, who at that time, incidentally, were in a very weakened state and needed Indigenous support in order to participate in their war against the French. So that treaty was very important at the time, and the fact that the colonial authorities recognized that they could not, in fact, take away that right, and that the purpose of the treaty was to ensure that the Indigenous people stayed out of the war and did not go to the French side, was also a very important effort. The Supreme Court recognized the existence of the right. The Supreme Court recognized that the right was protected and endorsed it. But then, of course, the commercial fishers refused to acknowledge that right. And so they attacked the Mi'kmaq fishers in particular, who were out on the ocean collecting the harvest that they were entitled to collect under the treaty. And even Department of Fisheries officers were trying to stop them from exercising their rights. And a considerable amount of violence was occurring on the water, to the extent, in fact, that there was an application to review the earlier decision by the Supreme Court. And in that later decision, in Marshall II, the Supreme Court is the one who said that the federal government can regulate the fishery if they want, and that the Indigenous right to fish, which was not at all limited by the treaty, only was available for Indigenous fishers to maintain a moderate livelihood, whereas before they used the fishing trade as part of their resource for trading with other First Nations and the colonial authorities.
Some very recent news has Mi'kmaq investing in Clearwater Seafoods, the largest producer of shellfish in North America. It may or may not solve this dispute, but is this a case of having to buy into an industry to secure what is a treaty right to harvest?
Well, I'm assuming that it's a good, wise business decision to begin with. I don't imagine that they would want to waste money investing in something that was not ultimately going to give them a good return. So I think it probably is a good decision, because the fishery is always going to be in place in Nova Scotia and in the Atlantic region. The thing that really strikes me as being ironic is that that particular fishery also provided resource outlet to the commercial fishers, who were the ones who were attacking the Mi'kmaq fishers to begin with. So it'll be interesting to see how that relationship dynamic works out in the long run.
Interestingly, Clearwater Seafoods chairman Colin McDonald called the deal as one which would advance reconciliation. Was this how you intended that phrase to be used?
Well, it might actually work out to be that in the long run, because it might force the commercial fishers and the Mi'kmaq fishers to actually see each other as equals. But at the same time, I'm always concerned when people trot the word out just to explain something that they would normally have had to do to begin with. Reconciliation is really about establishing the kind of relationship that we would have had but for the impact of colonialism. And it is quite conceivable, of course, that business relationships like this would have been established and would have been maintained without the impact of colonial oppression. And so I don't doubt that it probably is a reflection of what the relationship would have been like. Whether or not it was intended as an act of reconciliation, I think, remains to be seen. But I do think that this certainly advances the interests of the Indigenous fishers.
And speaking of reconciliation, the first recommendations from the TRC relate to child welfare. What do you think of the response from the federal government on those recommendations, which included new legislation, of course?
Well, just to put it in perspective, when we were drafting the TRC report, we had some very broad calls to action that we wanted the parties to use to establish their relationship into the future. But we also saw that there was an immediate need for issues to be addressed that were of critical importance. Issues such as health, education, internal resources to the community, roads, etc., child welfare, and the over-incarceration of Indigenous people were very critical issues, because we pointed out that this is just a continuation of the impact of federal and provincial governments to remove people from the community and place them into institutions away from their culture, away from their language, and put them into an environment of control. And we said that that's not a worthy objective of the relationship, and in fact that part of the relationship was not necessary, and there are ways to improve it. And we called upon the governments who were enacting those provisions that were causing those incarceration rates and those child welfare apprehension rates to be skyrocketing to do something about it. The Bill C-92, which recognized the right of Indigenous people to pass their own child welfare legislation, is a good first step. I think as legislation, we're going to find that it probably has some weaknesses that will need to be addressed. First of all, it's a pan-Indigenous law, and there are probably enough differences across the country that they're going to find that some Indigenous people are not going to benefit from a law like that in the same way that others might, and that there needs to be a more specific approach that Indigenous people should be allowed to take. Right now, it still is a controlling piece of legislation, and it probably needn't be.
Well, Senator Sinclair, it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and I hope to see you in Ottawa in person one of these days. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Todd. It was good talking to you.
After the break, 60 Scoop Healing Foundation named its board of directors today. So coming up, I speak to one of them. Welcome back. Our next guest wears many hats. He's a lawyer, a consultant on international trade between Indigenous peoples, and a 60 Scoop survivor. The scoop happened between the 1950s and early 90s. 3 years ago, survivors avoided a court trial by agreeing to an $875 million settlement. Part of that settlement is the establishment of a $50 million healing foundation, whose opening ceremony was held earlier today. Wayne Garnons-Williams is one of the directors of that foundation's board, and he joins me now. Welcome to Nation, Mr. Garnons-Williams.
Hi, Todd. Great to be here. Thank you.
First of all, what can you tell me about the picture we're showing? You weren't wearing a bow tie just for the heck of it.
No, that's the picture of me when I was approximately 4.5, dealing with the Adopt Indian and Métis group that basically dressed me up like a puppy for adoption. Because I was stolen from my original family and placed outside of my Indigenous culture. So that's the picture that went into the newspaper, the local newspaper in Saskatoon, the section Today's Child that ran once a week with a picture of some Indigenous youth.
So to turn now to what you're doing now, what will this foundation, this healing foundation, do?
Yeah, the Healing Foundation is I guess we're taking the torch from the interim board, which is giving us basically a legacy gift. It's the report, the 60 Scoop Survivors report that was written by consulting with personally with 530 60 Scoop survivors, but also thousands of other survivors that couldn't attend in person and attended online or through email. And they've all provided their ideas and the suggestions and their recommendations as to how to move forward with respect to the foundation. What would be the priorities? And that document, the Healing Foundation's report, is our our cornerstone to allow this permanent board to prioritize what we can do, what we can quickly get out in the form of a program and assistance to 60 Scoop survivors. So it's really exciting. The report is broken down into basically a bunch of topics. There's cultural reclamation, there's mental health, there's reunification, advocacy, education, and commemoration and community building. So all of these things are important, and they've been identified by the 60 Scoop survivors as something that the board can develop programs to assist the survivors. So it's a good time to be there, and I'm happy to say that the board is also it's made up of survivors, so that the board members are all survivors minus one. We're honored by having the presence of Justice Harry Laforme on our board, and he makes an excellent addition with his vast legal knowledge and his long-standing leadership. So we're looking forward to having his contribution on the board as well.
I was just reading just this morning on social media of Scoop survivors saying how difficult it's been to reconnect with their community when they don't know the language, the songs, or the ceremonies. Is this something that you feel personally and that this foundation could help you?
Absolutely. One of the things that is one of those priorities is cultural reclamation and its reunification. Getting tools out there, programs and services to allow for First Nations and Indigenous survivors to connect and reconnect, and to not just reconnect, but to culturally start redeveloping that long lost that skill and that knowledge. So I can tell from my first personal experience, my First Nation, the Mooseman First Nation, I had reconnected with my family early on when I was about 16. And then I went, and when I became an adult and a young lawyer, I went and I volunteered my work for the band. And the Mooseman First Nation has been really great in developing those open doors to allow for people to start coming back. So that's one example, but there are examples all across Canada with respect to the need to provide some program that allows for that reconnecting to happen.
Some First Nations, though, the doors aren't so open. I mean, what can you do when there might be some resistance from trying to welcome back some of these people?
Yeah, it's partly it's education. It's a little bit of advocacy, but it's more just informing the First Nations that are out there that may be a little bit reluctant to provide them with the information and the tools necessary, so that the rejoining can be as smooth as possible. It may take, it won't happen overnight, obviously, but it'll take time to, and especially now, given the fact we have a brand new board, and it's 10 people that have been thrown together that are right now relative strangers, but they come together with various skill sets and abilities, and we need to, in a pandemic, in a global pandemic, we need to figure out what we can best do to provide services in this challenging time period. So the board, first of all, has to look at the report, get ourselves up to speed as to a board itself, how we can function effectively with respect to our governance structures, and then build a priorities document that allows us to address the most important stuff and the urgent stuff first, and get those programs going. So we're confident and positive that we can get things this year going, because we have that wonderful legacy document that the 60 Scoop survivors provided, which gives us a guide as to what they feel is the most important things.
There was some criticism about the Healing Foundation that was created for residential school survivors, especially that it wasn't permanent. How will you avoid some of that criticism with this Healing Foundation?
Well, the Healing Foundation is permanent. One of the things that the feedback that we got from the survivors is they want this foundation to be permanent, to be a living entity that goes on in perpetuity. So it's not going to be an organization, and this is what the survivors have said. They've basically come back with given us a mandate to say, don't spend down the amount of money the foundation is holding, grow it, and keep the legacy strong, keep the education strong. and have it go in perpetuity. So that's one of those great things that, again, it's the leadership from the members, the survivors that have helped pave the way for this board to act so effectively.
How happy are you to see this day finally come?
I'm relieved. I'm relieved. It's for all those people that feel that they don't fit in, that walk in two worlds where they've been raised in one way, but yet their traditions call them to another, and yet they don't fit in either. This allows for a bridge so that there's a way home for people. And it's first steps, it's baby steps, but I think it's in the right direction, and I think we're going to get some really good reconnection going with respect to people that are looking for reestablishing their cultural and political ties with the Indigenous organizations.
Now, I just want to turn our attention to something a little bit completely different, because I know you're a keen observer of U.S. politics. There's reports that President-elect Joe Biden may appoint a Native American to his cabinet, a first. Your thoughts on that?
That is really cool. And the reason why Joe Biden, that press report came out, was the fact that in the state of Arizona, which is a really close call, I think it was only by 10,000 votes or 12,000 votes, the Native American vote was something like 60,000 in favor of Biden. So it made a huge difference in pushing Biden over. And so President-elect Biden has not forgotten about that. And so he wants to be inclusive of having a representative cabinet. And so the promise of having a Native American in cabinet, I think, is really cool. And of course, there's this wild rumor that it could be the Secretary of State, which would be responsible for trade. But that's my bailiwick. It would be really awesome, because then that would be also in keeping with the New Zealand Prime Minister Ardern appointing a Maori Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade. So yeah, I can hope.
Well, all around, it sounds like it's been a good day for you. Mr. Garnons-Williams, thank you for speaking to me.
Thank you. It's been fun.
We'll have more after another short break. Welcome back. It's not often that two guests on Nation to Nation interact in one event, but that happened earlier today. Senator Murray Sinclair was a keynote speaker at the 60 Scoop Healing Foundation's opening. So here's what he had to say.
When the Healing Foundation is doing its work, I wish it well, because this is going to be a very complex set of solutions that will have to be developed, and it'll take us a long time to get to that point where we can say that we no longer are on our healing road, but we are succeeding at life. Thank you.
And before we go, here's Richard Vadum with a unity song from that opening ceremony. I'm Todd Lamourand. Thanks for watching.
We are